Welcome, everyone. I think we'll get going here. My name is Kim Woodworth. I'm the Executive Director for the Economic Development Council of Colorado. Welcome. We're excited to have you all here today. This is a very important discussion. As you all know, it feels like we've been at this here for a couple of years now, and it just feels like it keeps coming at us. So we want to thank all of our speakers for being here with us today. So again, thank you. For those of you who are, or just a few housekeeping items, I'm sorry, you all have entered into this webinar on mute for our recording quality purposes. We encourage you all to ask questions from our presenters today. You can type them into the chat section, or you can raise your hand. But today's event is really to educate, to bring in new ideas and best practices forward. If you have any questions after this webinar, please send them to EDCC's administrator at bobby.vandenheuvel@edcconline.org. We will follow up after today's webinar with a link to the webinar and presentation. We will also post it to our website, to the web page that's dedicated to the EDCC's Knowledge Network series. And finally, please follow us today on our social media outlets at EDCCO. And be sure to use the hashtags Knowledge Network and EDCC events so that we can follow you. For those of you who are new to us, EDCC is a statewide industry association that supports the economic development efforts of across Colorado. We connect our communities and our members and our partners to high quality educational opportunities and trusted resources, and advocate for sound policies and programs that support a vibrant economy and enhance quality of life for all of Colorado. EDCC members come from a variety of settings. We are rural and urban, public and private sector, for-profit and not-for-profit, and include individual communities, counties, and regional organizations, local and state government, chambers of commerce, universities, and private industry. EDCC is building a virtual arsenal of information to keep our professionals updated on the latest trends, data, and case studies, and thought leadership papers that our professionals can take back to their locals to begin these important discussions at the local level. Currently, you can access the most current information on our events calendar and select those various events, or you can find it under the past events under each one of these pods. We're dropping the links into the chat section now. But here in a couple months, we're going to have an actual content library itself where all of the information from these events are going into their own separate posts. I'd like to go through our events and programming very quickly so that you're aware of what's happening in 2022. Today is our first of a two-part series of our very in-demand Knowledge Network series. If you do have burning topics that you want our professional development committee to consider, please take the survey at the end of this event, or email Adam and Stephanie, our co-chairs for the professional development committee. Those links are being populated into the chat section. We'll continue to host our Drive, Lead, Succeed virtual series, tackling some of the most difficult issues we have today. We'll be accompanied by our very popular thought leadership papers. Our first in a two-part series will be held on April 20th. We'll be focusing on labor shortages and supply chain woes. We're dropping that link to register into the chat section. We'll be celebrating Economic Development Week, so we hope you all are going to put together your celebrations for the local celebrations for that week. It's May 9th through the 13th. We're partnering with our friends at Downtown Colorado Inc. This is a week filled with local events and virtual training seminars, helping educate our community leaders on the value and importance of sustainable economic development. We are thrilled to announce that we will be in Pueblo this year for our annual Drive, Lead, Succeed conference, October 19th through the 21st at the Pueblo Convention Center. We encourage everyone to think about sponsoring these events, as it takes an army of volunteers and staff to get these events off the ground. There is great value in supporting our efforts in tackling our most perplexing issues and bringing the information and resources to our professionals that is needed to spur the innovation solutions at the local level. As a sponsor, you will be recognized through our various platforms, video recordings, website, thought leadership papers, in-person meetings, and more. Everything that we just mentioned is found at edcconline.org, events-calendar, which is being dropped into the chat section. Now I can be done with my job and let's get on to today's programming. So you may be curious as to why the Knowledge Network. We have learned over the past few years the power of collaboration and connectivity. EDCC continues to foster the professional network that we are so proud of here in Colorado. We have a treasure trove of leaders in our community of economic development professionals that have learned tricks of the trade, best practices, and quite possibly from their mistakes. After all, that's how we grow. This is our time to come together as an industry and support one another. We want to see each and every one of you succeed in your job, in your community, and in your profession. The credit all goes to our EDCC Professional Development Committee for devising today's session and the series. They are a group of amazing professionals with great energy and leadership, and it's all led by Adam Kruger with the City of Thornton and Stephanie Trawler with the City of Westminster. If you're a member and interested in getting involved, we would drop their contact information again into the chat section. I'd like to introduce to you today's moderator, Jeremy Reitman. By day, Jeremy is a recovering economic developer turned town manager for the town of Gibson, a small community found along the I-70 corridor that lies west of Vail and Beaver Creek. It's home to more than 8,000 Eagle County residents and best known for its rich gypsum mineral deposits. One of its larger employers, the American Gypsum Drywall Plant and Mine, employs over 100 employees. And most recently announced Tesla will building a 35,000 square foot sales, service, and delivery center south of the Eagle County Regional Airport. Jeremy has had a long history with EDCC, starting back in 2014 when he won EDCC's Eddie Award Rookie of the Year. He served 5 years on EDCC's board of directors, 3 of those on the executive committee, and served as board chair in 2018. He continues his service by volunteering on EDCC's Public Policy Committee. Let's give Jeremy a warm Zoom welcome by Zoom clapping or emojis or whatever that you want to put up there, a big smiley face. Jeremy, I'll let you go ahead and take it away.
Oh, well, I feel the digital warmth already. I appreciate it very much. So again, I'm Jeremy Reitman with the town of Gypsum. I really appreciate everybody joining this conversation today. I think it's really important. We've been a community that has similarly been impacted by a lot of these circumstances. And so it's pretty dear to our heart. So over the past couple of years, it seems like we're in a constant state of response. And, that's either due to pandemic, wildfire, floods, cyber attacks, you name it, we've got it. And it seems clearer now more than ever before that we all need to take the necessary steps to reduce the risk of disaster impact for our communities. We all have a stake in the success in how we mitigate a disaster and the negative impacts that it can have on our economies. And so today, our expert panel of speakers will present their unique case studies on how a disaster impacted them, what they did to mitigate the impact, and how they're planning to respond in the future. We'll also be joined by Mark Thompson. He's our State Hazard Mitigation Officer with the Colorado Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And he's going to help us identify resources and tools needed to create an effective preparedness plan and position our communities to be more resilient when disaster strikes. So first up today, I'd like to introduce Sana Kendall. She's the Senior Economic Development Manager at the City of Fort Collins. And Fort Collins, my previous town, I lived in Fort Collins for 10 years, beautiful community, I loved it there. But it's no stranger to natural disasters, everything from flooding and hail, severe thunderstorms and lightning, heavy winter storms, tornadoes and wildfires, most recently the Fern Lake Fire, which burned over 300,000 acres of land in Larimer County back in 2012. So Sana, can you tell us a little bit about past experiences the city's undergone and why the city's been proactive in building a microsite, educating its population on the hazards that they can expect and also how to plan for them?
Yes, thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, I would say, gosh, we've learned a lot in these times. And then to have, in addition, COVID plus wildfires, I think in the last few years, we've also really wanted to look at this holistically and not only look at just on the residential side, but what is happening for our business community and helping our business community really prepare in this space. I think those are things that have been really important for us in Fort Collins. An example is, are we sharing out that information to both our residents and businesses at the same time? Are we helping them be prepared? As you mentioned, we've had flooding. I remember, gosh, I want to say it was 2018, where we had quite a bit of flooding, and to the point where we thought some of our bridges were going to go out, and there is impacts in terms of transportation, but also how in terms of emergencies and what does that look like. So that was definitely a concern, and how do we help our businesses in that space? And I think I shared with you, Jeremy, also in early 2020, with the stay-at-home order and then pushing everyone to be outside, we had the wildfires, and we literally had ash burning, falling on top of us, as we've encouraged everyone to go outside. And then with limited capacity with our businesses indoors, that impact. And so we've been talking to our businesses a lot about, how do you prepare for the future? How do you become more resilient? And we continue to learn from our partners and communities elsewhere, such as Jill in the town of Superior, right? We were having discussions a few months ago about how do we help and really prepare our community in that space. So just preparation of that. And then a one, like, no wrong door policy, I think, is a really big piece. Having those relationships with all of your partners, SBDC, Chamber, your regional economic development organizations. Public health was a huge partner for us in future as well. So those are just kind of some of the items that we've discussed, and then really helping in solving those issues with our businesses in preparation for not only disaster, but what does federal support and grants look like in future. And happy to share more about that later, but wanting to make sure that we save space for our other panelists.
Absolutely. I mean, you're welcome to proceed on a little bit here if you'd like. I mean, I didn't know if there's anything in particular that you would like to share about something that you guys were very proud of with your work here in the last few years.
Yeah, I think when the pandemic happened, right, and the amount of federal dollars that was coming out, it was shocking for us, as we've shared. Fort Collins has over 7,000 business, that we only had about 350 that actually received grants within our CARES dollars. And one of the biggest questions was why? Why was only about 350 businesses actually applying for those grants? What was those things that were really hindering their ability? And so what I think we're really proud of is, with our CARES dollars, we said one of the grants will be financial preparedness. How do you get your books ready for the future in terms of federal dollars that we're going to be coming down through the American Rescue Plan? And one of the biggest pieces is we want to build trust within our community. So you pick that accountant or that bookkeeper to help you get that, but we're going to give you $500 to help you get prepared for that. And it is an educational piece. So it also helps them in the long run of, here's where we're seeing overages, here's where we're seeing supply chain challenges, those aspects. So that program are in itself to prepare additional businesses in terms of getting financially ready for federal dollars that were coming down in 2021 was a really big moment, I think, for our office of helping those that weren't typically seen or weren't our traditional businesses that are the loudest that say we need more dollars. They were the ones that are boots on the ground, head down, trying to just survive and really working in that space.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Sona. We'll come back to you with some additional questions later in our session. And we'll go to our next speaker, Jill Mendoza. And today's session topic was selected and spurred on largely by her, Jill Mendoza. She's with the town of Superior. And Jill serves on EDCC's Professional Development Committee and is the Economic Development Manager for the town of Superior. And it was the inconceivably destructive Marshall Fire that ravaged this town and made the community want to address this issue, or the committee want to address this issue. I don't think anyone, including FEMA, thought that this kind of disaster would have occurred at the scale that it did and the rapidity at which it occurred. New rules, new planning guidelines, new regulations are all being created in response to it as we speak. So, Jill, can you give us a glimpse into the first days after that disaster and what your community has learned from it?
Yes. So the response began immediately when we saw the smoke enveloping the town. It was very evident that something was very wrong and we needed to act immediately. I was with the Boulder Police Chief yesterday and we were discussing this in front of a group, and it was remarkable how quickly we were able to evacuate literally the entire town at a moment's notice, and how respectful and responsive the community was to the pressure of saying, you have to get out. So we're very proud of the initial response efforts to be able to evacuate the town. We did have 2 loss of life, but by and large, for this scale and pace of how it occurred, it was a miracle that there was not further loss of life. We formed a disaster response team immediately upon the disaster. We were working throughout the day and night of the holiday weekend that was happening. It was over New Year's, and it didn't matter. Everybody, all hands were on deck. We were trying to make sure that we were available and responsive. The number one thing that we learned through this immediate response effort was the need for communication. Everyone was impacted. Everyone was displaced. No one knew what the next steps were. And so it was clear that we needed to be very precise and communicative so that people felt like they understood what the next steps were, even if it was something they couldn't accept and they didn't want to abide by, but they knew that this was the way that it was going to happen. So communication went from one to many. Our groups were getting the same message out to hundreds of people at a time, thousands of people. And now our communication has shifted more to one-to-one. Now that we're 3 months out almost, we understand those that are impacted, the different priority levels of how they've been impacted and what we can do to get them back, what that timeline is going to look like. And so the communication has changed, but the need for communication is still there. And that has been really challenging because as a small staff, we only have 40 staff people, and in our communications department, there's 2. So there's a lot of different wearing of other hats in this crisis and disaster recovery process. As an example, I sent out an email this week about mental health resources, and that's not necessarily something that I've ever been an expert in or been it has been part of my role, but because of the nature of my role and because of the collaboration with other entities, I'm aware of those resources that are available. And in order to make sure that everyone knows about these resources, I went ahead and drafted an email that went out not only to the entire resident community, but also to internal staff about all the mental health resources that are available for free. So again, I just have to hit on the good working relationships, and those were in place before the disaster. The collaboration and the effort that it takes to quickly make decisions can only be done if you have the rapport and the relationships and you know who to call. And so that part, having good working relationships, especially at the leadership level, and being able to collaborate is really important. I will say another plug for the chief of police. They acted with such grace, the leaders in these roles in a time of crisis. And that is something that is really remarkable and admirable, that, I didn't witness any arguments, and there's so much tension around what's going on, but everyone acted so gracefully. And it's amazing how humans can really do what needs to be done in a time of crisis and really just care about the health and safety of others. So it makes you really proud to be a part of teams like this. And I think that the biggest challenge right now is really trying to shift from the immediate disaster recovery to what is the long-term plan. And as you mentioned, Jeremy, there's lots of decisions that need to be made. There are policies that were in place that potentially hinder redevelopment opportunities. There are requirements and that will make things more costly and not efficient. So we've been leading the way in trying to have these difficult discussions. And the hardest part about that is that it's taking time. An example is the debris removal. So for those of you that are not in our community every day, we're literally surrounded by piles of rubble everywhere. And this happened in December. And they're not gone yet. They haven't even touched them. So it's very frustrating for the residents, the businesses, and the community at large to understand, why is this happening? Can't we just go in, get a bulldozer, get everything cleaned up and pretend that this didn't happen? But that's not the process. The bureaucracy, unfortunately, that comes with these disasters, the financing that comes with it, it's a marathon. So the disaster recovery efforts in terms of the debris removal make the most sense by doing it collectively. And again, that's where you get to this level of collaboration. So we are collaborating with the neighboring communities and the county to make sure that we're doing this the most cost efficiently as possible. That will result in the best financial contribution from the governmental resources that are available to make this happen. So it prolongs the process, but there's really a reason behind it, and trying to communicate that and be compassionate to those that are impacted by it is the challenge. So, you know, the ongoing decisions and timelines are where we're facing the biggest challenge right now. And then on the flip side of that, I will say, now that we're out of the fight or flight mode, we're starting to see the mental health impacts of this at every level. So I've never been exposed to a disaster firsthand before, but I will tell you that it is very devastating, traumatic, emotionally. And there's no way around that. If you're exposed to it, you have some level of trauma exposure, and at varying levels depending on your exposure. So it's really important. And I think COVID helped us to address these issues a little bit more head on, that we have conversations and we get people resources to help support them through their journey, because disasters are very traumatic. So I'm happy to answer any questions and share more, but I do believe from an economic development standpoint, and that's why I brought this up as a discussion, we need to be more prepared. I never in a million years envisioned that I would be playing this role. I'm not equipped to do it. It's not a skill set that I have. It's not something I'm comfortable doing. And I don't know that I ever even considered it as an option. And I'm thrust into it and learning, but I don't want others to be in that position. So it's very important that you be honest with yourself about the possibilities and have a plan in place and know who to go to. And I think that we'll talk with Sana later about their disaster plan. It's very important to have a plan. And I'll give you an example. Avista Hospital is in Louisville, and their evacuation plan was extremely methodical, perfectly executed. It got national attention, and they did it because they had a plan in place and everyone knew their role. And I think that in communities, it's important that we also take it as seriously and know our role and have a playbook of sorts to be able to turn to in times of crisis. So I'm happy that we're discussing it here, and I hope that this actually helps us all to kind of move more towards a plan that that we have in place that we can lean on.
Well, thank you, Jill. I know that, yes, you never know when you're going to be thrust into a circumstance where you had no idea it was going to occur and you had no really can't even conceive of how you're going to deal with it. We were in a similar situation here in Gypsum a couple of years ago with the Grizzly Creek fire coming towards our community and planning an entire community-wide evacuation. And yeah, so everybody who's sitting in an economic development seat, just keep in mind that you're a utility player and you may be called to action in ways that you couldn't have even fathomed. So Jill, thank you very much. I know it's been a very stressful and emotional year so far, but fortunately your community has you and all of your team members there to help them through it. Moving on to our next case study in Glenwood Springs. So disaster didn't strike this community directly. Rather, the disaster happened 1 mile east of it. And I mentioned the Grizzly Creek fire here a moment ago, which burned nearly 33,000 acres in Glenwood Canyon by the time it was declared 100% contained on December 18th of 2020. The fire resulted in a 13-day closure of Interstate 70, which is the main lifeline to Glenwood Springs, and adding insult to injury, Highway 82 over Independence Pass was also closed due to excessive traffic and multiple accidents. There were down transmission lines interrupting power coming from the Shoshone Hydroelectric Power Plant, and the Union Pacific Railroad passenger and freight line was also closed after falling rock caused major rock piles on the line. And then we fast forwarded to July of 2021, and heavy rains created flooding on the burn scar, which left I-70 heavily damaged and impassable for quite a period of time, and forever changed the course of the river. And we've seen the impacts of this on both sides of the canyon. My community, the town of Gypsum, is on the east side of the canyon. Glenwood Springs is on the west. And we have, a workforce labor shed that originates on both sides. And that's been extremely disruptive to communities on both sides. And the detour isn't exactly a handy one. It's a 5-hour detour to the north, or 4.5 hours. And or in the summer months, perhaps a somewhat reasonable detour through Cottonwood Pass Road, but the road is inadequate for the traffic volume. And especially for freight traffic, it's a very difficult thing separating Glenwood Springs from the rest of the state. So here today, we've got Jennifer Uten. She's the Assistant City Manager and Economic and Community Development person for the city of Glenwood Springs. And Jennifer, can you talk about how the evolution of your disaster planning and where you guys are all at today?
Sure. So I guess I would start actually with the Grand Avenue Bridge project, which may seem like a surprising place to start, but so that project, if you're not familiar, was to remove the bridge that goes over the Colorado and connects into I-70. So the main route to downtown, it's the main route to Aspen, and the bridge was replaced. And we so took all of the traffic that would generally be on that road and shifted it onto a local road. And it was closed for 84 days. I think the original plan was 95 days. But what we did in advance of that was, sit down with all of our partners and had, hundreds of meetings in advance of that. But what it really did was solidify all of the relationships that are needed to be able to respond to a disaster. So we, as you mentioned, this latest disaster, the Grizzly Creek fire, it ignited on August 10th. And so it was on the steep slopes that's, above I-70, above Shoshone, the hydro plant, electric plant. But it also burned in the rugged terrain that is our watershed. So while we weren't impacted directly, like it obviously did not come into town, it did burn our watershed. So 9.2% of the no-name watershed and 2.9% of the Grizzly Creek watershed. So we had to act very quickly. Our public works director reached out very quickly to the firefighters and said, if you can drop slurry, we don't want the rest of that watershed to burn because that's where our water comes from. and they were able to keep the damage in our watershed to a minimum. But we still have lots of impacts related to that. We have lots of increased turbidity in our water as a result, and we had to make huge improvements to like our water intake system. So we had to armor the bank above our water intake, upgrades at the water treatment plant and the no-name tunnel that included settlement plates and mixed media filters and other plant equipment and chemical feeds. And then we had to act quickly to also, as we knew that we were going to need to have another water source. So we do have access to water in Rudai Reservoir, which is, it's up the Roaring Fork, up the 82 corridor, like you're going to Aspen, above basalt. And so we knew that we were going to need to make improvements to the way that we did our intake of water, and we had to go, talk to water court and do all the things that we needed to do exchanges. So I think we had an idea that this was something that would need to happen potentially. So I think we were able to act quickly. But I think we didn't necessarily, we didn't have plans for the, the $3.5 million of water improvements that we were going to need to the plant. And then, we had, I think it's $500,000 that we upgrades to the no-name tunnel. So we were impacted directly, and we have increased chemical costs as related to that. But we knew immediately that we would need to do those things. So we worked very quickly, got some funding from the Department of Local Affairs, and figured out a plan to be able to do that. And then we were able to react when we had those mudslides where we thought we had everything in order, but the gauge could only read to a certain point. So it actually let mud into the tunnel, and we were able to treat 2000 NTU, whatever the turbidity is. And it was very, very surprising. We did have to close, we did have to tell people that they couldn't use external water because we didn't have enough water in all of the various tanks to allow for people to continue to do landscaping, that kind of water and it was in the summer months. So obviously lots of water systems, irrigation systems that were going to go on early in the morning. And we did do a reverse 911 call very early in the morning. I think it was 4 or 5 on a Sunday, and people were very upset, but we also knew that we needed to be able to treat that mud in the system. It was going to take a lot longer to be able to treat it.
How much water storage capacity does your community have for the population?
I don't know if I have the total number,
Okay.
but we use about 2-ish million gallons a day, I think it is normally, and then it's like 5 million gallons in the summer months.
Yeah, the outdoor watering impacts dramatically increase utilization. So,
but I don't know what the storage capacity. We have various, storage tanks in various parts of town that are both for domestic water needs, but then also for firefighting needs.
Yeah. Were there any other kind of key highlights to how this situation impacted your community you'd like to share before we move on to our next speaker?
So highlights of how we reacted. I think what I would say is that, because we had all of these communication plans in place, and we have strong relationships with all of our emergency partners and the Forest Service and CDOT and the hospital, and then all of our business community, that we were able to react quickly, both to the emergency needs, but then also to kind of know that when there was the mudslide and the governor said, we don't know how long I-70 is going to be closed, we were able to really pivot really quickly related to, our marketing. So it started marketing to the West because we are a tourism reliant community, and we wanted people to be able to come, and we were still open, but we were not, folks are probably not, they're going to cancel their plans. They're not going to do a five-hour detour to be able to come here. So we have continued to do that marketing. And for the first time, actually, we did radio and Google ads in both English and Spanish. So $40,000 immediately when the mudslide happened, and we knew we were going to be closed for a while, and the governor said he didn't know how long, that we knew we needed to pivot all of our marketing to the West. And we just took the opportunity to start, and we're continuing to do that both in English and Spanish. It was the first venture into that for our Visit Glenwood folks.
Excellent. Well, I don't know about everyone else, but I'm starting to see a theme developing here that relationships are really important to be growing and fostering along the way, so that when you do have a problem, you've got all the people that you need to be able to respond to it. So focus on the relationships that you're developing with your partners. With that, it's our intent today that all of our participants kind of come away from today's session with tangible and immediate actions that they can take to better prepare themselves for and their community in the face of a disaster. And so joining us today, we've got Mark Thompson, our State Hazard Mitigation Officer at the Colorado Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And so Mark, first, will you tell us a little bit about your office and your role within it?
Happy to, Jeremy, and thanks, Kim and team, for the invitation and the opportunity to be here today, representing one part of the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, or DHSEM. It's certainly a mouthful if you don't use an acronym. And we are part of the Department of Public Safety, along with the State Patrol and Colorado Bureau of Investigation and Division of Fire Prevention and Control. So really integrating all aspects of emergency management and homeland security in a single department for the last 10 years. My team in particular is the hazard mitigation section, and we facilitate both the planning and project parts of hazard mitigation. And I have to start by saying two things that experience tells me can be somewhat frustrating when I'm trying to communicate what we do. And the first is that we are almost entirely focused on natural hazards. And that's driven by some of the silos within the federal government, between departments, and then within departments even. And ironically, what we can do for natural disasters, excuse me, includes things like risks from dam incidents or dam failures, but does not include pandemics. And that's driven by FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security not owning public health or pandemics at the federal level. The CDC does that, and so there's a silo related to that. And I mention that because it's going to tie back to some of the things that Jill and Jennifer and Jeremy talked about as well. The other part about mitigation is that we use a slightly different definition than the rest of the world. I think, Jeremy, you used the words mitigate the impact earlier, or something like that. And for us, mitigation is defined as long-term risk reduction from natural hazards. So something you do today that's going to reduce your risk in some way from one or more natural hazards for 20 to 50 years. It's not for a week from now. It's not for something that's happening right now. It is always looking at the future and that long-term risk reduction. And so within emergency management, there are really four phases. There's preparedness, which is the topic of today's presentation. And that is in our minds really preparing to respond or recover from an incident. So it's different planning that you do, it's different training that you do. And then the other phases are actually responding, recovering from, and then mitigation is the fourth phase. And what we're trying to display with this arrow here is that we uniquely cover all of those phases as a community moves through time, right? So on the left here, we see some regular operations in a community, comprehensive planning, continuity of operations, recovery, day-to-day business, whatever drives your daily life. And then a disaster happens. And immediately, as Jill pointed out, everybody moves into responding to that disaster, frequently in a role that you're not expecting or perhaps unprepared for, unfortunately. But it really is an all hands on deck situation. And for those of you that have been through this before, you know that disasters begin and end locally, right? So in the first hours or maybe first days, you're sort of on your own. And then help starts to arrive and you start to look at your short-term recovery. What do we need to do to get through the next few months up to a year? And then as that's going on, you start to think about what do we need to do for the long term to recover from this? And there are certainly parts of recovery that are designed to increase resilience in the community, in all parts of the community during that long-term recovery. And that's sort of where we come back into the picture. Once we step back out of the way during that response part, because there's a lot going on. And understandably, a lot of people in the first week or two aren't super focused on 2 years from now. It's what do I need to do to get through today? What do I need to do to get through this week? And that is understandable. And so we try not to interfere with that. But as folks start to think about the longer term, we come in and we say, how can we help you to rebuild more resiliently with an eye on your future risk reduction? And that's what we're trying to show here. And then the bullets at the top, this is part of a presentation I normally give to communities as they're beginning their mitigation planning process, which is a 5-year cycle. The plans are good for 5 years. And it works a lot better in person than in a virtual forum like this. But what we're trying to do really is prevent foreseeable, predictable consequences that are unacceptable to a community. And we know we can't do that for every situation or for every risk or every vulnerability, but we want to try and address as many of them as we can. And again, we're here to help communities throughout these phases of emergency management. And if you'd move to the next one, next slide, please. That would be helpful. And so Jill knows this, and Jennifer and Sonia probably know this as well. When you have a disaster, there are a lot of people that come to help, but we're all sort of siloed within our areas of expertise. Everybody means well, and we try to work together, but at our core, we're siloed by funding sources and in areas of expertise. Within Boulder County right now, there's a lot of, or there's growing frustration about, well, where do recovery and mitigation overlap, and it's not necessarily a clean handoff, unfortunately. But again, our focus on the long-term risk reduction, whether it's before or after a disaster, offers some opportunities to break the cycle of destruction. And so on the left-hand side, you see some examples of some project types that are pretty common. The one on the left is an example of just elevating a home so it's out of the floodplain. And we haven't done that a lot in Colorado, but we might be doing it in Boulder County, in the unincorporated county, with some of the homes that were damaged by wind. They're in the floodplain, but they were built before the floodplain rules were in place, but now they're going to have to meet those rules. And so elevation might be one of the ways that we help them do that. There in the center, fuels reduction and defensible space around homes. We do a lot of that work in the state. At the center, or acquisition and demolition or acquisition of properties and moving homes is typically thought of for in flood prone areas. And we certainly do that in Colorado. But here in Colorado Springs, where I live a few years ago, we also did that for a number of properties that had suffered landslide damage in areas that are still active landslide areas. And so we know there'll be future damage. So we remove the homes from that area, and that's a way, all with willing sellers. We can't make anybody, we don't want to make anybody. But that's another way where we reduce future risk by not rebuilding in a hazard prone area. And then on the right, just a couple of examples of things that are important, certainly in the response phase, communications, command and control, but they're not long-term risk reductions. They're not things that fall under our umbrella. Next, please. In 2019, the National Institute of Building Sciences updated its analysis of the benefits of mitigation and the investment and the payoff from that investment. And prior to this, a lot of folks were familiar with the numbers that, hey, for every dollar you spend on mitigation, you're going to save $3 to $4 in future costs for responding and recovering from disasters. Well, they looked at it in even more detail leading up to the 2019 report. And you can see here that they broke that return on investment into 5 specific hazards, typically the most damaging in the US. And they looked at 5 potential solutions or things that offer benefits. So you can see at this point in time, it was adopting the 2018 set of codes or exceeding those codes or retrofitting, or lifelines are kind of your critical facilities, critical infrastructure, everything tied to those, protecting those. And then anything funded by any federal grant going back to the early 1980s. And so you can see there, simple table that says, hey, if you invest dollars in this, these are the future cost savings you can expect. And those costs include some of the indirect costs, the costs of mental health recovery for people that are stricken by disasters that were previously not included. It used to be much more objective, not objective, but much more kind of reconstruction oriented as opposed to community rebuilding oriented. And so you can see there again the value of investing in your future risk reduction. And where the other part of my team, I've talked a little bit about projects, and that's one of the things that my projects team helps with. And I put a link in the chat to our current grant opportunity announcement. But I also have my planning team joining us here today, and that's Irene Merrifield and Emily Palmer. And the other part of what we do is assist communities across the state with mitigation planning. So they're long-term risk reduction planning. So if you go to the next slide, please. And it starts just like any other deliberate planning process with what problem are we trying to solve? And in our case, the problem is risk. And risk is defined as where do people and communities overlap natural hazards, whether it's flood, fire, landslide, high wind, whatever the case may be. So what problem are we trying to solve? What do we have that we can use to solve that problem? And that can be codes, it can be ordinances, staff, contract staff, financial capabilities, financial constraints, and then communicating with your population so they are on board and support the efforts you want to take to reduce that risk. And most importantly, is once you understand the problem you're trying to solve and the assets and capabilities you have to solve them, how do you want to use those assets to solve the problem? And that can include, hey, we need new capabilities. And so that's where the 2 parts of our section, the mitigation section, help out, is we have the planning team that is around the state, always helping communities understand their risks and make sure there's a shared understanding of risk, and then determining what they want to do about those risks. And then where it's appropriate, my projects team comes in and helps them apply for grants to actually implement the actions that will help reduce that risk moving forward. And I saw a question pop up in the chat. Let's see here. Yeah, so Tyler asks, certainly mitigation can be expensive. And one of the challenges in a community is we don't think that's likely to happen, or that doesn't happen here anymore. And we have limited dollars. And so why should we spend them on something that may never happen? And I understand that. But if or when a disaster happens, do you want to look back and say, we could have done something about this and we chose not to? And sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no, but that's a question that a community has to face. And as far as economic development, it does take dollars away from economic development, certainly. But the benefit is it creates an economic resiliency. Many of you know that a lot of small businesses that drive a lot of local economies, they don't have a post-disaster plan that involves them being in that community anymore. And so a disaster can not only destroy homes, cause loss of life, but it can take away jobs, and it can take away tax base from a community that can sometimes trigger a downward spiral that communities don't recover from. And so, Tyler, I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but I hope that addresses it.
Yeah, and actually, I might tag on to that a little bit, Mark. One of the corollaries I see with this, and maybe there's some research findings that could be, passed across these different domains, but I think the area of personal health is very similar to this. That, I think largely everyone knows that smoking is bad for you, and that eating poorly will lead to long-term negative consequences for your health. And yet we're all still humans. And, maybe I still want that cigarette, or I want those Twinkies. And I think, has your office looked into, I feel like there's a few factors that motivate people to action. Some is just having the data and the facts, like the slide that you just presented about the cost savings aggregated across time, although that's hard to localize to a specific community. And yeah, I'm just curious whether you guys have looked into ways to motivate people to action. The other element that I think is involved here is, especially at the governmental level, you do have pressures from the political side that are very time limited in terms of their focus. You may have council members or folks who want to achieve certain results in certain domains, promises that they've made to the public, and those promises involve dollars that they may need to allocate for those purposes, and they don't leave any room for what our discussion's about today. So, I mean, that's just a human issue that I feel like it's going to be difficult to overcome. How do you guys work to address some of those dynamics?
Well, I won't tell you that we've been super successful in that. Some people in communities are more open to reducing their risk than others, and some of it's risk tolerance, some of it's truly whether or not they do understand their risks. And frequently it comes down to hoping and helping them learn from somebody else's disaster. After the Marshall Fire and in the weeks after, there were other communities across the Front Range who are pretty similar to Louisville and Superior and in that part of Boulder County, who stopped and said, can that happen here? Yes, that can happen here. Is there anything we can do about it? But that tends to fade. and it can fade pretty quickly. And so a couple of communities that reached out to my office in January, by February, they were sort of out of interest. And so part of the way we do it is not focus a lot of our time and effort trying to convince people in like a big push, but for the folks that are definitely interested, helping them early so that we can maintain their interest in pursuit of a project or a grant to fund a project, or getting them to the right other agency that can help them with that project. And for the ones that are less interested, kind of taking the long view of let's just try and chip away at their resistance, whatever the cause, to invest in their risk reduction. And then another part of it is these grants, these project grants that we can help communities get, they're not just for public infrastructure. They can be for individual homes. They can be for individual businesses. But it's overcoming the thought that, well, that money's all going to go to the Front Range. It's not feasible or realistic for it to come here. And if you don't ask, it's certainly never going to come. And so part of it's just that part. FEMA grants are not, at least in mitigation, they're not known for being super user friendly. We promise our local partners that they're not going to be pain free, but we'll try and make them as painless as we can. And so in some cases, we've helped communities understand that the impediment was one person on staff that didn't want to take on something new. That person didn't see the value, and so they tried to kill it before somebody a little higher up the hierarchy said, no, that is important to us, and we're going to continue to pursue it, and you're going to take that on. I won't name the city, but a few years ago they had a new floodplain manager who didn't feel maintaining their status within the community rating system, which is a subset of the National Flood Insurance Program, was a good use of his time, because it only affected 12 homes and 12 policyholders who were each getting about a 15% reduction in their insurance premium, their flood insurance premium, because the community was in this program. And that was kind of a big deal to us and our FEMA partners. So I contacted the city manager and I said, hey, do you know this is happening? And I get it, 12 homeowners out of however many people you have in your city doesn't seem like a big number. I just want you to know that at the end of this year, you're probably going to have 12 very upset homeowners. And I'd rather you make an informed decision than just sort of let this happen. And pretty immediately, the elected officials and city manager said, no, that's important to us. We're going to keep doing that. And so it's understanding that communities don't invest in this for different reasons, and trying to address their individual reason for not doing so.
Yeah. And part of the reason I asked that question, hopefully just to plant the seed with all of our economic developers, that maybe it is the job of the economic development community to, if you're the staff member in your community that has hopefully a longer tenure than some of your elected officials, that you may create some of that institutional memory and stability that can be advocating for investment in mitigation, to protect the business investments and the community investments that are made in your community. So I think, as we've all learned over the last few years, economic development has many different facets, from housing to broadband to everything else. And I think this is just an opportunity to be an advocate for investing for your community for the long haul. Mark, could you maybe give us a couple of examples of where your office has worked and what roles you guys have played in specific mitigation efforts? Just
certainly. On the western slope, we've done quite a bit of defensible space projects with the West Region Wildfire Council, using Uray County as their fiscal agent. Right now, we're working again with West Region Wildfire Council on a risk assessment and risk communication program that they're setting up in 6 counties. It's Delta, Gunnison, Hinsdale, Montrose, Uray, and feels like it might be, I think I got all 6. So something across 6 counties. Colorado Springs, we've done a number of projects to help stabilize eroding stream banks that are encroaching on personal property or private property, as well as public infrastructure. We're doing something similar with the city of Walsenburg, following some of their post-fire flooding from the spring fire. We did a lot in Boulder, Weld, and Larimer counties following the 2013 floods. We're hoping to get more parts of the state involved in the opportunities that we present, because the flood risk is everywhere. But in some cases, there's been a lot of successful flood mitigation efforts through dams and whatnot, and so there's no recent memory, and so there's no recent, risk awareness there. Right now, we're really excited, excuse me, to be working with almost all of the rural electric co-ops across the state to help them identify where is their infrastructure at risk, which hazards are causing the risk, and what can we do to help reduce that risk. So in the eastern part of the state, they might be more concerned about high winds, tornadoes, and ice storms. And there are things that we can do there, whereas in the west, it might be more fire, rockfall, landslide, avalanche type stuff. And there are different things that we can do there. Because they're concerned. They've seen what happened in California, and they don't want to cause a fire like that, or they don't want their infrastructure destroyed by a fire like that, as some of them suffered in the East Troublesome Fire in Grand County. So we're very, very active across the state, and we're just really getting started in Louisville, Superior, and Boulder County, following the Marshall Fire.
Right. Well, one of the things we want to do with this session here is try to give people the motivation to go back and start these conversations in their own community. So from your perspective, Mark, what can communities, and specifically our economic developers in these communities, do to start these conversations in their communities, try to draw the right people together to participate and benefit from this process? How do they get started?
So with the mitigation plans that I mentioned earlier, for a variety of reasons, people think those are emergency management plans, but they're not. They're community plans. And as members of the community, there is a place at the table for our economic development experts, for business owners, for chambers of commerce, for all the drivers of local economies to come to the table and represent those interests, not just for the businesses but for the employees. And by being at the table, you're bringing another perspective to the overall community resilience. Every community in Colorado is proud of itself for some unique aspect. And a lot of local economies are driven by that unique aspect that they're proud of. And so protecting that unique aspect that brings people in protects the business and economic climate of the community. Jennifer mentioned how tourism driven Glenwood Springs is. Well, we can help those tourist drivers to protect themselves from risk. But if you're not at the table, nobody's going to bring that up. And maybe nobody's going to think about beyond the hard numbers of people at risk and buildings at risk that can be protected from future hazards, as opposed to, hey, our community is more than just people and buildings. And so the more perspectives that are at the table, to include the folks that are here with us today, the better that community plan, the better that risk assessment, the better that mitigation strategy is going to be.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for all of your insights. Hopefully this will be really insightful for a lot of folks and get them motivated to make some changes and be proactive about reducing risk going forward. With that, I thought I'd go back to some of our panelists here. Jill, you spoke earlier to the need for communication and how that started out being one to many and now one to one. Since you guys have just been through this, what were the tools that you guys used for the one to many conversations, and now what tools do you think you might invest in or feel like you need that you wish you would have had? And that'd be question one. And then the second would be, when you went to one-to-one conversations, where are those conversations happening? Who are those with?
Sure. So again, I come from a very small community. We only have 14,000 residents, so population. So it's a bit easier to have that kind of communication. So I don't know that the tools would be similar in a Fort Collins or a Westminster, where there's hundreds of thousands of residents. So we're fortunate in that we already had those relationships. We had a well-established newsletter that went to the community that they were very highly engaged with, and even more so once we had the disaster. So they were signing up, and they knew where to go for the information. So we used constant contact. I will say the communications at one point got excessive, and there was an opting out, and so we could kind of refine what people wanted to know, and we were responsive to that, and we kind of adapted our messaging over time to be more appropriate as things unfolded. I will say also, from the business perspective, I think that's why it's very important to have a business list. And I know it's an ongoing battle for all of us because it changes so frequently. The managers change. It's hard to keep it updated. Many of us do it on spreadsheets. Some of us have CRMs to do it, but it is something that in the time of a disaster, being able to reach out to the decision makers at a business is critical. And again, that's where I'm fortunate. I only have about 300 businesses in Superior, and I already knew and had relationships with most of them. So I knew exactly who to go to. They were in my email. So it was very easy to have those conversations, but it still reinforced the fact that there were gaps. And how did I close those gaps once I knew that I wasn't able to reach, a person at this business, or a property owner at this business, or a property manager? So it definitely illuminated the holes that exist, and we all struggle with that on an ongoing basis to try to keep those databases current. I will say that one of the things that you can do is to make sure you reach out to businesses annually and get updates from them, contact information, decision maker contacts, so that you can continue that dialogue and have those conversations and be viewed as a trusted resource. I think that, yes, businesses are inundated with surveys and things of that nature, but if they know that there's a reason behind it and that they can rely on you to do that annual outreach, and they provide it and know that there's a reason, I think they'd be willing to do that. So that was just something that a takeaway that I had, is that I will definitely be doing that going forward. Now, the ongoing conversations are with those that are still recovering. Many of our businesses have reopened and they're just adjusting to the different circumstances now. We've had a little bit of a decline in customer volume and things like that, so they're adapting, but they don't necessarily need the recovery support now. So now I've kind of grouped the businesses into different recovery efforts and understand where they're at, what their timelines look like. So I'm having conversations with mostly the business owners or managers, kind of making sure I'm up to date on what their status is, any support that they might need from us, and trying to make sure that our community elected officials, town leadership are aware of those timelines, just because huge businesses like Target, if it's closed for a period of time, we're losing sales tax, major sales tax revenue, and understanding that and being able to communicate that. Luckily, a lot of these timelines have been compressed, which, we were looking at worst case scenarios, 6 to 9 months of closure. Now we're looking at more on the 6-month side for these long-term closures, which is great. To see that they'll be able to rebound. And then also, looking at it as an opportunity to rebuild, to make improvements, to make things better, make the businesses better, make the environment better. We're taking that opportunity now to kind of look at the silver lining here and see how we can. It definitely brought our community together. I feel more connected to the community now than ever, and I already felt like I had good connections, but now I feel intimately connected to them. I know them, I care about them. There's just a level of compassion and understanding that we have, and having gone through this together. So the businesses, I feel even closer to them now than I did before, and really understand who they are and their families. And so it has brought us together as a community. And I think that the long-term goal is to make it stronger in the long run. And how do we do that with this opportunity that we're faced with to rebuild?
Great. Well, thank you, Jill. And I think, just given Sana's in a larger community context, I don't know if you have any comments on that same question, Sana.
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss this. I think, you are right, Jill. I think the relationships are one of the biggest pieces. When COVID happened and we were hearing about the stay-at-home order and the capacity restrictions, in our community, Fort Collins is a community of 175,000. And I think the challenge with our community is, in our organization, the city of Fort Collins, is we have a communications department that really wants to control what message is going out, and those aspects. We had to ask for an exemption and activate pretty quickly, but what we asked for was our sales tax, right? Contact information for every business in our community. And it won't always go to the business owner. It might go to, let's say, their accountant or others, but it was important for us to reach out to every business in our community about what was happening with the fast pace of the information that was happening. So I would say, talk to your sales tax department about the contact information and having that readily available so that you can, in an emergency, be able to communicate out. I would say using different forms of communication is really important. We had some via email, we had some via text. WhatsApp for our Latinx community in Northern Colorado has been a huge kind of a channel of communication. So we were using WhatsApp. In addition, I think a big lesson learned for us was when we're communicating out to have it in not only English, but in Spanish. So making sure that it is translated, especially really difficult information that, especially when English is your second language, is really difficult to translate. So having that availability was a big piece. And then lastly, I would say what we found in Fort Collins, as Northern Colorado, we can have a business in Fort Collins, in Loveland, and in Windsor, and in Greeley. And so it was really important to also have coordinating messages with our partners. And Jill, you spoke about that quite a bit too. So we actually have a business communication team, and we discuss with all of our municipalities and groups, what is that business communication we're going to be sending out for the week or for the next 2 weeks. That's shared out, and then we add in additional items that are just specific to Fort Collins. But that way, the regional message is still going out for those businesses. So they're not having to say, what is the rules and regulation in Windsor, which is both Weld and Larimer County, versus what is the regulation in Fort Collins when I'm doing operations in Fort Collins. And so I would say those are a couple items that I would just want to highlight, is making sure and have that shared messaging regionally, talking with your sales tax department, because they're probably going to have the most up to date, and then utilizing different forms of communication and different avenues of that as well.
Absolutely. Now, if anybody has questions of their own, please feel free to type them into the chat, and I'd be happy to make sure that we try to address them here in the time we have left. You know, I will say for Jennifer, you mentioned, you know, relationships have been a theme in this discussion. And in your context, who were the key stakeholders that you had to pull together to have an effective response?
So I think, you know, the obviously big businesses in the community. We actually, in the very beginning of the pandemic, started meeting weekly with our Downtown Development Authority, our Parks Department, major businesses, workforce development chamber, our Visit Glenwood folks. So we had a standing meeting and have used that in various ways over time to be able to pull people together and to deploy the messaging that we needed to deploy for whatever event it was. And then, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we because we'd had this planned emergency, longest planned detour in US history, that we had all those relationships with, you know, Forest Service and CDOT and the hospital, and have a group me text so that, you know, there's actually a closure of I-70 right now. And the PIO group and CDOT and all the hospitals are on that text, so we can know in real time what's happening. And then we can take that message to whoever else we need to take that message to, you know, the business list, or reaching out to a specific entity who we know is in the multiple work sheds. And so that those folks have the information. Sometimes it's internal only, but it helps the hospital know, for example, if people are not going to be able to come from your side of the canyon to be able to get to work, if it's an extended closure, how long that closure is. So I think having those relationships and having built all those lists in advance, and having the tool that we use GroupMe for that, to be able to deploy the messages is really, really important. And, you know, every emergency situation is different, but because the relationships are so strong, we're able to work together and figure out whatever it is that, you know, if it's the pandemic or, you know, mudslide, or, you know, we just have regular closures of the interstate when, you know, there are major accidents, kind of thing. And then I would just reiterate the need for Spanish messaging. We, in the very first weeks of the pandemic, we started doing a Facebook Live with public health and the mayor, and then kind of a guest. And the first time we did it in Spanish, our police chief is bilingual, and so he did his message in English, but he also then did it in Spanish. And then the questions that we were getting were just heartbreaking that people didn't have that information. And so we have really transitioned, basically, I'm not going to say all, but probably 80% of all of the messaging that the city puts out, now we've put it out in English and Spanish. And we've done listening sessions in Spanish, and then we translate it into English. So we have worked in lots of different ways since the pandemic, retooling all of those options, but really focusing on the dual language for sure.
That's an important point, especially with our diverse communities here in Colorado. And Mark, I had a final question here for you as we get wrapped up towards the end of the half hour here. Maybe something that people can take home with them. So how can businesses receive FEMA mitigation grant funds to reduce their risks from natural hazards?
Thanks, Jeremy. So the first part, like I talked about earlier, is being a stakeholder and a participant in that planning process. And I mentioned the mitigation strategy. So by being in that process, you identify where are the risks to your constituencies, and then what can be done to reduce those risks. For example, again, won't name the city, but they have a Walmart, which is near a river, and half of the Walmart parking lot is in the floodplain. And that's kind of a big deal, because half of the parking lot's in what we consider the 100-year floodplain, although we technically call it something else now. But the building, the store itself, is in the 500-year floodplain. So if you have a really major flooding event, what are the impacts on the community from the loss of that business, in terms of jobs, the things that they sell, the community needs following a disaster. If you're tourism driven, think of the ski industry. How much of the skiing infrastructure is exposed to fire, right? And what happens if that infrastructure is lost to fire? That could be the hotels, the lifts, whatever the case may be. What happens long term to the community if those go? People stop coming, at least for a few years. And so being a participant in this planning process, and then working with the community to to find funding for those solutions. I mean, these FEMA grants, although we work through counties, municipalities, special districts, the recipients of those benefits can be, again, individual homeowners, individual business owners, collective business kind of industries within a community. And so that's really being at the table. And if you want to know how to get to that table, the easiest way is to contact your county emergency manager. There are only 3 counties in Colorado that don't have one of these plans. And they're only good for 5 years. So they're almost always in some type of, we're getting ready to plan, we're planning, we're taking a short pause before we get ready to plan again. So the county emergency manager, unless you're in one of our larger cities like Fort Collins, the county emergency manager is your best contact to reach out to. I know we have somebody from Westminster, that's Greg Moser at the fire department. We got a few where the county might not be the best. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question and kind of gives okay, we've got a call to action. Here's your first step.
Absolutely. That does. Thanks a lot, Mark. So I hope the speakers' comments today have been eye-opening. I know they have been to me in terms of how ever present these risks really are in our communities, even though sometimes they seem a little far off or maybe even inconceivable. And so I hope everybody will take this discussion and use it as motivation or fuel or whatever you want to call it to better prepare your communities for what uncontrollable challenge might lie ahead. I know, at least for myself, when I hear Jill speak about this incident, it almost brings me to tears. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers today, close out this portion of the event, and turn it over to Stephanie Trawler, co-chair of the Professional Development Committee.
Hi, everybody. I certainly also want to start by saying thank you to all of our speakers and sharing your perspective, your industry knowledge, and the unfortunate hard-learned lessons that we are all a little bit better after today's conversation. I certainly, as a fellow economic developer, respect everything that you guys are going through right now, and certainly appreciate you sharing with us and hopefully raising all the boats. I also want to thank the Professional Development Committee and all my fellow co-chairs. There's a list of everybody's name. If you have interest in reaching out to either the speakers or to the chair committees, just please let us know. And just a few closing notes. This recording and presentation will be emailed to everybody. I think Bobby is going to be putting up a survey, a quick survey, if you don't mind taking that and let us know how we did and what we could do to better serve you as professional development and learning needs. Please feel free to do that. Again, if you can, thank you, Bobby. Upcoming events, they're also on the website, and certainly you could visit the EDCC website to learn more about each of these events, and certainly register. There's a lot coming up in 2022, and we certainly look forward to seeing you on April 20th for the, and again, on the labor shortages. Please visit EDCC online for all professional development opportunities, training, networking. It's a great resource. I hope everybody has learned from today's session, and I hope you all stay safe out there and take good care of each other. Thank you all so much.